Before history books decided what was worth remembering, there were men whose lives were too dangerous, too powerful, and too inconvenient to be taught. This is the story of one of them. In the shadow of Kentucky's slave markets, where names were stripped away and hope was sold by the pound, an enslaved man named Elijah Anderson began doing the unthinkable. While masters slept peacefully, believing their system was unbreakable, Elijah was quietly breaking it, one human life at a time. He did not carry a staff like the biblical Moses, but he led people through darkness just the same, guiding enslaved men, women, and children toward freedom while risking a death more brutal than chains. White authorities called him dangerous. Slaveholders called him a thief of property. But to the enslaved, Elijah Anderson became a whispered legend, the Moses of Kentucky, a man who knew secret paths, coded signals, and the cost of mercy. His name spread across plantations, not in ink but in courage. So why is his story missing from classroom? Why is the man who challenged an entire slave state barely a footnote today? This is the true story of Elijah Anderson, the freedom fighter history chose to forget. He was born into slavery in Kentucky at a time when the state existed in a cruel in-between space, neither fully north nor fully south, neither openly defiant nor morally free. Kentucky called itself a border state, but for those born in bondage there was no border, no edge where suffering softened. Elijah Anderson entered the world already owned, his first breath taken on land where his body was considered labor, his future measured in profit, his name written in someone else's ledger. The laws of Kentucky allowed slavery to survive under the thin disguise of moderation, but moderation meant nothing to a child whose life had already been claimed. Plantations in Kentucky were often smaller than news deeper in the South, but the brutality was no less real. Enslaved children learned early that silence could mean survival and curiosity could mean pain. Elijah grew up watching adults move with careful restraint, speak in lowered voices, and avoid eye contact with white overseers whose power was unquestioned, and whose punishments were immediate. From the moment he could walk, he was surrounded by invisible rules: where to stand, when to speak, how to bow his head just enough to avoid suspicion but not enough to invite ridicule. Childhood did not exist in the way the free understood it. There were no years of innocence, only years of preparation. Kentucky's geography shaped his earliest understanding of the world. Rivers marked boundaries that promised something better on the other side, yet remained unreachable. Roads led north, but they were watched. Towns buzzed with commerce, but black bodies moved through them only under permission. Elijah learned the names of places not because he had visited them but because they were whispered after dark. Ohio, Indiana, Canada. Words spoken softly as if they might escape into the air and be punished for their boldness. Even as a child he sensed that Kentucky was not just a place but a trap, carefully positioned between hope and terror. Families in Kentucky slavery lived with a constant instability that shaped Elijah's earliest memories. Mothers disappeared without warning, sold to distant plantations. Fathers vanished after failed escapes or sudden accusations. Children were passed from one owner to another like tools, loaned and returned. Elijah learned quickly that love was dangerous because attachment made loss sharper. Every morning carried the possibility of separation, and every night was spent wondering who would still be there at dawn. These lessons did not make him cold, they made him observant. He watched faces, memorized voices, studied silences, learning how to read fear before it was spoken. Work began early. Elijah's small hands were put to use long before they were strong enough, his body trained to endure exhaustion as a normal state. He learned that pain was not something to react to, only something to survive. The whip did not always strike, but its presence shaped behavior more effectively than motion ever could. Even when no overseer was near, the threat lingered, invisible and absolute. Kentucky's enslavers prided themselves on control without chaos, but that control was built on constant psychological pressure, a quiet violence that settled into the bones. Religion was everywhere, but it was twisted to serve power. Elijah heard Bible verses used to justify obedience, sermons that spoke of patience and reward in the afterlife while denying dignity in the present. Yet within the enslaved community, those same stories were reshaped. When elders spoke of Moses, they did not emphasize obedience but escape. When they spoke of the Red Sea, they spoke of impossible crossings made real through faith and courage. Elijah absorbed these stories, sensing that they held meanings far deeper than the ones preached from white pulpits. Even as a child, he understood that stories could be weapons. Kentucky's position as a border state meant movement was constant. Traders passed through, free black sailors came up the rivers, rumors drifted in from the north. Elijah grew up in an environment where information leaked through cracks, and those cracks mattered. He listened carefully when adults spoke of runaways who had nearly made it, of patrols that failed, of roads that were safer than others. Knowledge became a quiet form of power, and Elijah learned to collect it without appearing to seek it. He asked few questions aloud, but his mind was always working. His birth into slavery did not crush his spirit, but it sharpened it. Each restriction became something to be studied, each rule something to be tested in thought if not in action. Kentucky's enslavers believed proximity to free states made their system more humane, but for Elijah it only made the injustice clearer. He could sense freedom close enough to imagine yet far enough to remain unreachable, and that tension planted something restless inside him. He did not yet know what form resistance would take, only that submission would never fully claim him. From the beginning, Elijah Anderson's life was shaped by contradiction. Born in a state that claimed restraint while practicing cruelty, raised in chains within sight of freedom, taught obedience through fear while secretly absorbing stories of defiance. His earliest years were not marked by a single defining moment, but by an accumulation of realizations, each one adding weight to the understanding that slavery was not only an external condition, but a system designed to erase possibility. And yet even as that system closed around him, it failed to erase his awareness, his memory, his capacity to see beyond the boundaries drawn around his life. Elijah Anderson's earliest understanding of cruelty did not come from the lash, but from the sound of names being called in places where people were priced. Slave markets were not distant concepts whispered about in fear. They were visible, living spaces that bled into daily life. In Kentucky, these markets existed alongside churches, courthouses, and shops, making them impossible to ignore. Elijah saw men and women lined up like inventory, their ages guessed, their bodies inspected, their value debated by strangers who spoke about human lives with the same tone used for livestock. Long before he understood the language of money, he understood its power. As a boy, he watched families enter these markets together, and leave them broken apart. Mothers clutched children tighter when traders approached, knowing that affection itself could raise suspicion. Fathers stood rigid, their silence mistaken for strength, while terror churned beneath their stillness. Elijah learned that the most painful moments were often the quietest ones. The pause before a sale, the breath held while waiting to hear a name, the split second when hope flickered before being crushed by a stranger's decision. These moments carved themselves into memory, teaching him that slavery's deepest violence was separation. Kentucky's position made it a pipeline rather than an endpoint. Enslaved people were gathered, sorted, and shipped south, sold to harsher plantations where survival itself was uncertain. Elijah saw wagons loaded with people heading toward riverboats, chains clinking softly beneath forced calm. He learned that the direction of travel mattered more than the distance, that being sold down the river was a sentence worse than death for men. Children learned geography through grief, memorizing places they would never see but feared endlessly. Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, names that carried the weight of disappearance. Family separation was not an occasional tragedy, it was a tool of control. Elijah witnessed owners threaten sales as punishment, using the fear of separation to enforce obedience. A whispered warning could silence an entire household. The mere suggestion that a child might be sold was enough to break resistance before it began. Elijah observed how this fear reshaped behavior, how adults bent themselves smaller to protect their children, how older siblings took punishments meant for younger ones, how love itself became an act of quiet bravery. These sacrifices were rarely spoken about, but they were understood. He saw his own community change after each market day. Spaces left empty did not simply refill, they lingered, heavy with absence. The missing voices altered conversations, the missing hands increased labor, the missing faces haunted sleep. Elijah learned to recognize grief that had no outlet, sorrow swallowed because mourning openly invited suspicion. Tears were shed at night, prayers whispered into the ground, memories guarded like contraband. He learned that survival required remembering without revealing, loving without displaying, grieving without collapsing. Elijah's exposure to these markets taught him how power operated in plain sight. White buyers laughed, argued, negotiated, treating the sale as routine, while black lives pivoted on their whims. He noticed how even kind words could mask cruelty, how smiles accompanied decisions that destroyed entire bloodlines. He learned that evil did not always announce itself with rage. Sometimes it arrived politely, with paperwork and payment. This understanding stripped away any illusions about mercy within the system, and replaced them with clarity. As he grew older, Elijah began to notice patterns. Certain traits raised prices, certain ages drew attention, certain skills sealed fate. He watched young men sold for strength, young women for youth, children for potential. He noticed how lighter skins sparked different conversations, how family resemblance could become a liability if buyers feared emotional attachment. These observations were not academic, they were survival knowledge. He understood how quickly circumstances could change, and how little protection familiarity offered. The constant threat of separation forced Elijah to develop emotional discipline. He loved deeply but carefully. Attachments were formed with the awareness that any bond might be severed without warning. This did not make him numb, it made him intentional. Every shared meal, every stolen moment of laughter, every whispered story carried urgency. Time together was never a... He learned to hold people in memory as fiercely as he held them in life, preparing himself for loss without surrendering connection. Slave markets also exposed Elijah to resistance in subtle form. He saw elders sabotage sales by feigning illness, mothers hide children's strengths, fathers exaggerate flaws. He learned how information could be shaped, how bodies could perform weakness, how silence could become strategy. These small acts of defiance did not always succeed, but they planted seeds. Elijah understood that even within cages, choice existed in fragments, and those fragments mattered. The trauma of separation followed Elijah everywhere. Even when no sale occurred, the possibility lingered, shaping every interaction. Joy was cautious, celebration restrained, futures imagined only in pieces. He learned that slavery did not only steal the present, it poisoned the future by making long-term hope dangerous. Planning beyond the next season felt reckless. Dreaming aloud felt like inviting punishment. Yet internally, Elijah's imagination refused to be fully contained. Each separation he witnessed hardened a quiet resolve, a growing belief that no system built on breaking families could ever be legitimate. These experiences reshaped his understanding of freedom. It was not simply the absence of chains, but the ability to remain whole, to stay connected, to choose who remained in one's life. Elijah saw that slavery's greatest theft was not labor but continuity, the destruction of lineage and legacy. Names were lost, histories erased, connections severed deliberately to prevent collective memory. He recognized that preserving stories, remembering origins, and honoring bonds were acts of resistance in themselves. By the time Elijah reached adulthood, the images of slave markets and broken families were etched into his consciousness. They fueled his awareness, sharpened his empathy, and deepened his anger, not as wild fury but as focused understanding. He knew what was at stake each time someone whispered about escape, each time someone hesitated out of fear for loved ones. He understood why people stayed and why they fled, why courage looked different for everyone. The markets had taught him that slavery thrived on isolation and terror, and that any challenge to it would have to confront those forces directly, not only by breaking chains, but by reuniting what had been torn apart. Elijah Anderson's awakening did not arrive as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, unavoidable reckoning shaped by violence. He could no longer explain away. Brutal punishments were not rare events meant to shock. They were deliberate performances meant to instruct. He had seen whippings before, heard screams carried across fields, watched bodies return broken and silent, but there came a moment when punishment stopped being background noise and became a message he fully understood. The system was not correcting behavior, it was demonstrating ownership, reminding everyone watching that mercy was not part of the design. One incident carved itself deeper than the rest. A man accused of planning escape was dragged before the others at dawn, his crime never proven, his fate already decided. Elijah stood among the forced witnesses, his feet rooted in the dirt, his eyes trained forward because looking away invited suspicion. The overseer spoke calmly, almost casually, explaining that the punishment was necessary to preserve order. The whip fell with measured rhythm, each strike landing not just on flesh, but on the collective body of everyone watching. Elijah felt each blow as if it were his own, not from empathy alone, but from understanding that the lesson was meant for him too. What disturbed him most was not the pain inflicted, but the deliberate choice to make it public. Punishment was theater, and terror was the intended audience reaction. Elijah watched faces around him, some hardened, some vacant, some trembling, and realized that the goal was not obedience but submission, the complete surrender of inner resistance. The system demanded not only labor, but belief, the internal acceptance that rebellion was futile and suffering was deserved. That realization unsettled him more than the blood on the ground. As days passed, the image refused to fade. Sleep brought fragments of sound and motion, the crack of leather, the tightening silence afterward. Elijah found himself questioning not the cruelty itself. He had always known slavery was cruel, but its purpose. Why such excess? Why such ceremony? The answer became clear in pieces. Fear had to be renewed constantly, or it weakened. Punishment was maintenance,
not justice. This understanding shifted something inside him, transforming fear into clarity. Another punishment followed, then another, each reinforcing the pattern. A woman accused of speaking back, a boy punished for working too slowly, a man beaten for protecting his wife from harassment. The reasons varied, but the response was always disproportionate, calculated to erase dignity. Elijah began to notice how punishments were timed after whispers of resistance, after rumors of escape, after any sign that enslaved people were thinking beyond survival. Violence was the system's response to imagination. He also noticed the silence that followed. No one spoke openly about what they had witnessed. Conversations skirted around it, eyes avoided acknowledgement. This silence was part of the punishment's success. But Elijah felt something different stirring within it. The quiet did not feel empty. It felt charged. He sensed thoughts being shared without words, understandings forming beneath the surface. People remembered who had been punished and why, storing those details carefully. Fear spread, but so did awareness. Elijah's awakening came with anger, but it was not reckless. It was focused, sharpened by observation. He saw that those who enforced punishment often feared it as much as those who received it. Overseers watched nervously, hands tight on weapons, aware that cruelty bred resentment they could not fully control. Elijah realized that violence revealed weakness as much as power. A system confident in its legitimacy would not need such constant reinforcement. The punishments forced Elijah to confront a choice he had avoided naming: endure and adapt, or resist and risk everything. Until then, survival had been his primary goal, shaped by caution and restraint, but witnessing repeated brutality altered his understanding of survival itself. Living without resistance began to feel like a slower form of death, a gradual erosion of self that punishment accelerated rather than prevented. The fear that once kept him quiet began to lose its grip, replaced by a different fear. The fear of becoming someone who accepted this world as he began to listen differently. Stories shared in hushed tones after punishment carried new weight. Tales of runaways were no longer fantasies but responses, logical reactions to an unbearable reality. Elijah found himself replaying routes in his mind, imagining distances, calculating risk. He studied how punishment affected people differently, noting who broke and who grew quieter but stronger. Resistance, he learned, did not always look like defiance. Sometimes it looked like patience sharpened into preparation. Witnessing brutality also deepened his sense of responsibility. He understood that punishment isolated individuals, making their suffering appear personal rather than systemic. Elijah began to see the danger in that isolation. If each punished person was seen as an exception, the system survived unquestioned. Recognizing this, he started connecting stories, quietly linking incidents together in his own understanding. Punishment was not about individuals failing. It was about a system sustaining itself through terror. The moral clarity that emerged from these realizations did not bring peace. It brought restlessness. Elijah found it harder to perform obedience convincingly, harder to internalize submission. He became more careful, not less, understanding that awakening made him vulnerable. Every look, every pause, every response had to be measured. Resistance required discipline before action, awareness before movement. He learned to control his expression, to hide his thoughts even as they grew more dangerous. Punishment also taught him the cost of visibility. Those who resisted openly were destroyed quickly, their examples used to warn others. Elijah realized that survival and resistance were not opposites, but stages. Endurance created the conditions for action, and action required invisibility. This understanding shaped his emerging sense of strategy. He did not reject fear. He learned to use it, to let it sharpen his focus, rather than paralyze him. As he carried these lessons, Elijah's view of authority shifted. He no longer saw overseers and masters as unassailable figures, but as enforcers trapped within a violent structure. Their power depended on compliance, their authority maintained through constant display. This perspective did not make them less dangerous, but it stripped them of mystique. Fear became grounded, manageable, something to be navigated rather than obeyed. Each punishment he witnessed reinforced his conviction that slavery could not be reformed or softened. It could only be resisted or escaped. The idea of waiting for change from within began to feel like complicity. Elijah's awakening was not loud or dramatic. It was internal, steady, irreversible. Once he understood punishment as language rather than consequence, he could no longer hear it without translating its meaning, and once translated it demanded a response that went beyond endurance.
Elijah Anderson's world began to widen the moment he realized that not all black people lived under the same shadow. The discovery did not come through announcement or permission, but through fragments. Half-heard conversations, brief encounters, and carefully guarded secrets. Free black communities existed on the margins of Kentucky society, visible enough to be known, but hidden enough to survive. They lived in towns, worked trades, owned small plots of land, and moved with a confidence Elijah immediately recognized as dangerous knowledge. Their existence alone challenged everything slavery claimed to be permanent. His first meaningful exposure came through work that took him beyond the plantation's inner boundaries. Errands into town revealed faces that did not lower their eyes, voices that spoke without trembling, and movements unshaped by constant surveillance. Elijah noticed how free black men carried themselves differently, how they negotiated wages, argued points, and walked away without fear of reprisal. These observations unsettled him more than punishment ever had, because they revealed a version of life slavery insisted did not exist. Freedom was not abstract, it was embodied. Contact was never direct at first. Free black individuals were cautious, knowing that association with enslaved people invited suspicion and violence. Conversations were short, coded, and deliberately ordinary, yet within these exchanges meaning traveled beneath the surface. A comment about weather might signal safe movement. A question about family might carry an offer of help. Elijah learned that survival in freedom required the same discipline as survival in bondage, just expressed differently. Trust was earned slowly, measured by consistency rather than words. Abolitionists entered his awareness as rumors long before faces. Some were black, some white, but all operated in secrecy. Elijah learned to distinguish between those who spoke loudly about justice and those who worked quietly to undermine slavery's machinery. The latter were more dangerous and more effective. They understood that exposure meant destruction, not just of themselves but of entire networks. Elijah sensed that true resistance required invisibility, patience, and coordination beyond individual courage. The connections formed through careful observation rather than invitation. Elijah listened more than he spoke, allowing others to determine whether he was safe. He understood that one careless word could end lives. Over time, small acts of trust accumulate. A direction offered without explanation, a warning delivered as casual advice, a name mentioned once and never repeated. These fragments formed a hidden map of relationships, linking plantations to towns, towns to river crossings, crossings to northern roads. Free black communities functioned as both refuge and intelligence hubs. They knew which patrols were active, which roads were watched, which slave catchers were operating nearby. Elijah began to understand that escape was not spontaneous. It was planned, supported, and sustained by people who risked everything without recognition. These communities operated under constant threat, navigating laws designed to erase them, yet they persisted through cooperation and shared purpose. Abolitionists brought resources but also risk. Some provided forged papers, others offered transportation, shelter, or money. Elijah learned that each form of assistance carried consequences. Papers could fail under scrutiny, wagons could be searched, safe houses could be betrayed. There were no guarantees, only probabilities managed through experience. Elijah absorbed these realities carefully, understanding that hope without preparation was another form of danger. What struck him most was the absence of heroism in these networks. No one spoke of glory or destiny. The work was practical, grim, and exhausting. People acted not because they expected success, but because inaction was unacceptable. Elijah felt drawn to this ethic. It matched what he had learned from punishment and separation, that survival required action shaped by awareness, not faith alone. These connections showed him that resistance was collective, not individual. Trust became the central currents. Elijah learned how it was tested quietly. Someone might be asked to carry a message without knowing its content. Another might be given incomplete information to see if they pressed for more. Silence was valued as much as speech. Elijah proved himself through restraint, by not asking questions that endangered others, by remembering details without recording them, by blending into ordinary routines while holding extraordinary knowledge. Through these connections, Elijah encountered stories of successful escape, not myths, but specifics: who left, how they traveled, where they hid, what mistakes nearly cost them everything. These stories were not inspirational speeches, but lessons learned through suffering. Elijah studied them carefully, noting patterns and failure. He understood that each escape altered the network, forcing adaptation. Nothing remained static for long. The existence of abolitionist support reframed Elijah's understanding of risk. Before, escape seemed like a solitary leap into darkness. Now it appeared as a series of calculated movements supported by unseen hands. The danger remained immense, but it was shared. This realization shifted his sense of responsibility. He was no longer thinking only about his own survival but about whether he could be trusted to protect others within these fragile systems. These secret connections also revealed internal tensions. Not all abolitionists agreed on methods. Some favored immediate action, others patience. Some trusted widely, others guarded fiercely. Elijah learned that even within resistance, disagreement existed. What unified them was not strategy but refusal, the shared rejection of slavery's legitimacy. This complexity made the network stronger, forcing constant evaluation rather than complacency. Elijah's growing involvement remained quiet. He did not declare allegiance or receive formal instruction. He absorbed knowledge through proximity and observation. He learned which gestures signaled recognition, which phrases closed conversation, which silences invited continuation. This unspoken language became second nature, a parallel reality layered over daily life. To outsiders, nothing appeared different. To Elijah, everything had changed. These connections also carried emotional weight. Elijah saw people who had lost family yet continued helping others escape. He met individuals who lived in freedom while carrying constant fear of capture or re-enslavement. He understood that freedom was not an ending but a condition requiring defense. This awareness stripped escape of romanticism and replaced it with realism. Liberation demanded vigilance. As Elijah's understanding deepened, so did his caution. He knew that discovery meant not only his own punishment, but the collapse of networks built over years. The weight of that knowledge disciplined him more effectively than any overseer ever could. His actions became deliberate, his speech measured, his movements calculated. He learned to exist in two worlds at once, one visible and compliant, the other hidden and resistant. The secret connections with free black communities and abolitionists did not offer Elijah immediate escape, but they offered something equally transformative: context. Slavery was no longer the entire world, but a system surrounded by opposition, pierced by pathways, weakened by cooperation. These connections reframed his suffering as part of a larger struggle, one that required patience, secrecy and unwavering commitment to others whose names might never be known but whose actions shaped the boundaries of what was possible. Elijah Anderson's understanding of escape shifted from theory to terrain as he began learning the hidden routes that threaded through Kentucky and stretched northward into Ohio and Indiana. These paths were not drawn on maps or spoken of openly. They lived in memory and gestures, in stories passed carefully from one person to another. Geography became a form of resistance. Every bend in a river, every fork in a road, every stand of trees carried meaning. Elijah learned that freedom was not just a destination, but a sequence of decisions made in motion. Kentucky's landscape offered both danger and possibility. Rolling hills concealed movement, but open fields exposed it. Rivers promised passage but demanded timing and silence. Elijah learned to read the land the way others read books, noticing where patrols favored visibility, where travelers avoided at night, where natural features disrupted pursuit. He understood that escape routes were not fixed lines but flexible systems that adapted to threat and opportunity. What was safe one week could become lethal the next. The Ohio River dominated his imagination. It was both boundary and barrier, watched relentlessly yet crossed countless times by those who understood its rhythm. Elijah learned that water did not erase tracks, but it confused them, that sound traveled differently over its surface, that fog could become protection. Crossing points shifted with seasons, currents, and patrol patterns. He memorized not just locations but conditions. When water ran low, when boats moved freely, when storms created chaos that could be exploited. Travel through Kentucky required invisibility more than speed. Elijah learned which roads were safer than shortcuts, which farms tolerated strangers, which taverns were traps disguised as refuge. He understood that movement during daylight was not impossible but required confidence and cover stories, while night travel demanded silence and patience. The choice between them was never fixed. He learned to adjust based on who traveled with him, how many and how prepared they were. Ohio and Indiana represented more than free states. They were complex terrains of their own. Freedom there was not guaranteed by law alone. Black travelers faced kidnapping, betrayal, and hostility. Elijah learned that escape routes did not end at the state line but extended deep into networks of support and concealment. Safe houses were scattered like islands, connected by trust rather than proximity. Missing one could mean exposure. Finding one required recognition without confirmation. He learned to measure distance not in miles but in risk. A shorter path through open ground might be deadlier than a longer route through woods. A familiar road might attract patrols precisely because it was. Elijah studied patterns of movement, how slave catchers anticipated escape, how they set traps near obvious crossings, how they exploited fatigue.
Understanding pursuit was as important as understanding flight. Navigation required more than physical knowledge. It demanded time. Elijah learned when patrols changed shifts, when markets distracted attention, when holidays thinned surveillance. He learned to listen for subtle signals, dogs being prepared, extra riders gathering, rumors spreading. Escape routes depended on patience as much as courage. Leaving at the wrong moment could doom even the best plan. The routes themselves were often imperfect. Some passed through hostile territory, others through uncertain refuge. Elijah learned that trust was uneven, that allies could falter under pressure, that help sometimes came at a cost. He learned to prepare those who traveled with him for disappointment as well as hope. False expectations were dangerous. Survival required clarity. Weather became a tool rather than an obstacle. Rain erased scent and sound but slowed movement. Snow revealed tracks but discouraged pursuit. Heat exhausted both fugitives and hunters. Elijah learned to weigh these factors carefully, understanding that no condition was purely good or bad. Each carried trade-offs that had to be managed. He also learned the importance of redundancy. No route was ever the only route. If one path failed, another had to exist. Elijah memorized alternatives, fallback locations, places to scatter and regroup. He understood that capture often followed predictability. Variety was protection. Learning these routes changed how Elijah saw the land he had known all his life. Familiar fields became corridors. Woods became cover. Rivers became thresholds. What once felt like confinement began to reveal possibilities layered beneath control. The same roads used to transport enslaved people south could be reversed in purpose, used to move them north. The system's infrastructure contained the seeds of its undoing. These lessons were not abstract. Elijah tested them cautiously, sometimes alone, sometimes guiding others short distances to safer ground. Each successful movement reinforced knowledge. Each near failure sharpened it. Mistakes were corrected quietly, lessons absorbed without blame. The network learned as a whole, adapting constantly. Elijah also learned the limits of physical routes. Knowledge without coordination was insufficient. Routes had to align with shelter, food and medical care. Exhaustion could undo careful planning. Injury could halt movement entirely. Elijah learned to assess who was ready to travel and who needed more time. Escape was not an act of will alone, but of preparation. As his familiarity deepened, Elijah became a keeper of. He held details in his mind with precision, aware that writing them down invited destruction. Memory became his map, repetition his method. He understood that forgetting was as dangerous as betrayal. Each route carried lives within it. Learning the hidden routes transformed Elijah from an observer of resistance into a participant. He was no longer imagining escape. He was tracing it, measuring it, preparing it. The land itself became an ally when understood correctly, offering concealment, misdirection and passage to those who respected its rhythms. What remained was not certainty but readiness, a state of constant calculation shaped by the understanding that freedom lay not in a single crossing, but in mastering the journey that led to it. Organizing night escapes required Elijah Anderson to move from knowledge to responsibility, from understanding routes to guiding lives through them. Night was not chosen for romance or secrecy alone. It was chosen because darkness disrupted the system's advantage. Under cover of shadow, familiar spaces became uncertain to those who relied on surveillance and routine. Elijah understood that night did not erase danger, it redistributed it, shifting risk from constant observation to sudden discovery. Every escape began long before anyone moved, shaped by preparation that could take weeks or months. Selection was the first burden. Not everyone who wished to flee could be included, and this knowledge weighed heavily. Elijah learned to assess readiness quietly, watching who could remain calm under pressure, who could move silently, who understood the cost of a single mistake. He learned that desperation alone was not enough. Escape demanded discipline, endurance, and the ability to follow instruction without question. Saying no was sometimes the most responsible act, even when it broke hearts. Planning involved silence as much as speech. Elijah coordinated through gestures, shared glances and coded phrases that meant nothing to outsiders. Times were set indirectly, often tied to ordinary events. A task completed late, a delivery delayed, a prayer meeting extended. He understood that obvious secrecy attracted attention, while normalcy concealed intent. The escape itself was often the least visible part of the process. Families complicated everything and made everything necessary. Guiding individuals was dangerous. Guiding groups multiplied risk. Children could not be expected to understand silence or restraint, yet leaving them behind was unthinkable. Elijah worked with parents to prepare children without alarming them, turning instructions into games, rehearsing movements under the guise of chore. He learned that fear could be managed but panic could not. On the night of escape, Elijah became something different. His awareness expanded outward, tracking not only his own movement, but that of everyone with him. He listened for changes in sound, watched for unnatural stillness, felt the tension of bodies behind him. Leadership in darkness required certainty without arrogance. Doubt transmitted instantly, infecting the group. Elijah learned to project calm even when uncertainty pressed hard. Movement was slow and deliberate. Speed invited noise. Hesitation invited capture. Elijah chose routes that minimized exposure, even if they lengthened the journey. He understood that fatigue could be managed but pursuit couldn't. He signaled pauses not when people wanted them but when they were necessary. Each stop carried risk, but so did exhaustion. Elijah also prepared for failure. He designated points where the group would split if discovered, understanding that scattering could save some even if it doomed others. These decisions were brutal, made in advance to avoid chaos. He carried this weight alone, knowing that leadership meant making choices that would never feel just. Trust was tested constantly. A single misstep, a snapped branch, a whispered name could undo everything. Elijah learned to position himself where he could intervene quickly, steadying someone who stumbled, silencing a child before sound traveled. These moments required decisiveness without cruelty. He understood that fear needed guidance, not reprimand. External help mattered, but reliance was dangerous. Elijah planned each escape as if no one would meet them. Even when safe houses were arranged, delays happened, allies were compromised, weather shifted. Elijah taught those he guided to expect nothing beyond the next instruction. Hope was maintained through progress, not promises. When encounters occurred, Elijah relied on judgment sharpened by experience. Not every stranger was a threat, and not every helper was obvious. He learned to read posture, tone, time. He avoided confrontation whenever possible, understanding that invisibility was safer than courage. Violence was a last resort, its consequences unpredictable. As escapes succeeded, Elijah's reputation spread quietly. He became someone people sought out without naming. This increased danger. Attention, even admiration attracted scrutiny. Elijah responded by tightening secrecy, limiting knowledge, rotating routes. He understood that effectiveness depended on remaining unremarkable. Failure was inevitable. Some escapes ended in capture, betrayal or tragedy. Elijah carried these outcomes deeply, reviewing every decision, searching for preventable mistakes. He learned that perfection was impossible, and that responsibility did not end with outcome. Grief became part of the work, born privately to avoid paralyzing others. Organizing escapes also changed Elijah's understanding of freedom. It was no longer personal. Each successful journey created obligations to those who followed, to those left behind, to those who risked shelter. Freedom became relational, sustained by continued action. Stopping would mean collapse, not rest. Night after night, the work continued, shaped by adaptation rather than routine. Elijah's adjusted plans based on changing patrols, shifting alliances and growing pressure. He learned that resistance had no finish line, only phase. The moment one group reached safety, another began preparing to move. Through these efforts, Elijah refined his leadership not through authority but through reliability. People trusted him because he measured risk honestly, because he did not promise safety, because he acted with consistency. His presence steadied panic, his silence communicated seriousness, his decisions shaped survival. Organizing night escapes transformed Elijah from a guide into a conduit, connecting fear to movement, despair to action. Each journey carried the accumulated knowledge of previous ones refined through experience and loss. The darkness that once symbolized terror became a working environment, navigated through discipline and care, where every step forward was taken with the understanding that survival depended not on bravery.
Coded messages, songs and signals became Elijah Anderson's quiet language of survival, a system designed to move information without attracting attention. Open speech was dangerous, easily overheard and easily misunderstood. Codes, however, lived in plain sight. They passed through conversations, prayers, and work rhythms without raising suspicion. Elijah learned early that the safest message was the one that did not sound like a message at all. Songs were among the most powerful tools. They were expected, even encouraged, by enslavers who believed them to be signs of contentment. Elijah understood their deeper utility. A familiar melody could carry shifting meanings depending on tempo, emphasis, or repetition. A line sung slowly might signal delay. Sung faster, it could mean urgency. A change in verse could indicate danger ahead or safety behind. Elijah learned to listen not just to words but to breath, timing and tone. Work songs offered cover for communication. Fields echoed with sound, masking subtle variation. Elijah could pass instructions through rhythm, signaling when to prepare, when to wait, when to abandon a plan. Overseers heard noise. Those listening closely heard direction. The same song could mean different things on different days, keeping patterns from forming. Predictability was avoided deliberately. Spoken codes were equally layered. Ordinary phrases carried hidden meanings agreed upon quietly. Asking about weather might refer to patrol activity. Mentioning family might signal readiness. Elijah learned to adjust language based on who was present, embedding messages within sentences that appeared harmless. These exchanges required precision. A single misplaced word could unravel trust. Gestures mattered as much as speech. The way a hat was held, the direction of a glance, the placement of an object could convey instruction. Elijah used these signals to coordinate movement without stopping or speaking. Passing someone on a road could become an exchange of information in seconds, unnoticed by those nearby. Silence was often louder than words. Visual markers guided movement at night. Stones stacked in certain patterns, branches broken deliberately, cloth tied where it should not be. These signs were temporary, removed or altered quickly to avoid detection. Elijah learned that permanence was dangerous. Messages were meant to be read once, then disappear. Memory carried what could not be written. Codes also protected against betrayal. Not everyone knew every mean. Information was distributed in layers, ensuring that capture did not expose entire networks. Elijah understood that secrecy was not mistrust but survival. Even those acting in good faith could be forced to speak. Limiting knowledge limited damage. Songs served another purpose beyond communication. They sustained morale. Fear narrowed the mind. Rhythm widened it. Singing together regulated breathing, calmed nerves, and maintained pace during movement. Elijah used music to steady groups, to keep children quiet without silence, to prevent panic from taking hold. The same melody that carried instruction also carried reassurance. Elijah learned to adapt codes constantly. Once a signal became too familiar, it was changed. Consistency invited attention. Variation preserved safety. This required constant coordination. Quiet updates passed through trusted channels. Learning never stopped. The system evolved with pressure. Religious language provided additional cover. Biblical references passed unnoticed by those who heard them daily. Elijah learned how scripture could mask direction, how prayers could mark time, how sermons could conceal warnings. Faith became camouflage as much as comfort. Those listening carefully understood that sacred words could carry practical meaning. Children were taught differently. Codes for them were simplified, embedded in games or stories. Elijah understood that complexity increased risk. Instructions had to be memorable without explanation. He learned to communicate through repetition and association, turning movement into routine. Fear was reduced by familiarity. Mistakes happened. A signal missed. A song misunderstood. Elijah treated these moments seriously but quietly. Corrections were made without blame. Panic was avoided. He learned that maintaining confidence mattered as much as accuracy. Doubt spread faster than error. Coded communication reshaped Elijah's sense of language itself. Words were no longer neutral. They carried weight beyond surface meaning. He became deliberate in speech, attentive to how things were said rather than what was said. Listening became an active skill, sharpened by necessity. These systems allowed coordination across distance and time. Plans could be adjusted without meetings. Warnings could travel ahead of danger. Hope could be signaled without promise. Elijah saw how communication itself became resistance, undermining a system that relied on isolation and ignorance. As pressure increased, codes grew more subtle. Meaning moved deeper, buried under layers of normalcy. Elijah learned that the most effective signals were the ones least likely to be noticed. Obvious secrecy invited scrutiny. Ordinary behavior concealed extraordinary intent. The use of coded messages demanded discipline. Emotion had to be restrained. Urgency had to be controlled. Elijah trained himself to deliver warnings calmly, to hide concern beneath routine. Panic in communication could unravel preparation. Control preserved clarity. Through these methods, Elijah and those around him created a parallel world of meaning layered over daily life. Two conversations could occur at once. One heard by everyone, the other heard only by those prepared to listen. This duality became essential, allowing coordination under constant surveillance. Coded songs and signals did not eliminate risk, but they reduced it. They turned community into infrastructure, culture into strategy. Elijah understood that this invisible network was as important as physical routes, perhaps more so. Without communication, movement collapsed. Without shared understanding, courage scattered. In mastering these codes, Elijah refined his role not just as a guide of bodies but as a keeper of meaning. He protected language itself from capture, shaping it into a tool that could move freely where people could not. The system that sought to silence and control voices was challenged by voices that spoke without being understood, by songs that carried more than sound, by signals that traveled unseen through a world that believed it was being watched completely. The constant threat of bounty hunters and slave patrols loomed over Elijah Anderson's every step, shaping his movements, decisions, and even thought. In Kentucky, the system of enforcement was pervasive and relentless. Slaveholders relied not only on the labor of the enslaved, but also on a network of people tasked with maintaining control through fear and capture. Patrols roamed plantations and roads, vigilantly scanning for signs of escape, while bounty hunters moved with calculated precision, motivated by profit and reputation. To Elijah, they were a force as real as the chains that bound bodies, a presence that never truly disappeared even in moments of supposed safety. Awareness of these dangers began early. He learned to recognize patterns in the movements of patrols, noting when they passed, how they signaled each other, and how they responded to rumor or suspicion. A single misstep in timing could result in capture, and Elijah understood that it was not enough to move quickly. Movement had to be strategic, coordinated, and concealed. Knowledge of routines became a survival skill, and observing the behavior of those enforcing slavery was as important as memorizing escape routes. Bounty hunters represented a unique threat because they were mobile and independent, not constrained by the oversight of a single plantation. They operated on reputation and reward, tracking fugitives across counties, often using informants or disguises. Elijah learned that bounty hunters could strike anywhere at any time, and that trust was limited even among free black communities. He studied their methods, how they used horses, how they read tracks, how they anticipated the desperation of those fleeing, and he incorporated that understanding into his own strategies. The unpredictability of encounters demanded constant vigilance. Elijah never assumed safety, even in familiar places or during seemingly ordinary tasks. Every trip to town, every errand, every nighttime movement required evaluation of risk. He learned to watch for unusual behavior, listen for distant sounds, and anticipate interference before it appeared. Threats were not only physical but psychological. The fear of being hunted shaped decision-making and forced caution in every action. Escape itself became a delicate balance between speed and stealth. Running recklessly could attract attention. Hesitating could allow pursuers to close the distance. Elijah learned to gauge the terrain, timing, and proximity of potential threats in real time, adjusting pace and route as conditions changed. Each decision carried weight, because one error could imperil not only himself but those he guided. Leadership required constant awareness of both the immediate environment and the broader landscape of pursuit. The presence of patrols also influenced how Elijah interacted with others. He became skilled in reading people, identifying those who might inadvertently expose plans or betray confidence. Not all dangers were overt. Sometimes the greatest risk came from misplaced trust or careless speed. Elijah learned to convey urgency without panic, to direct without drawing attention, and to teach others how to behave under scrutiny. Discipline, patience, and observation became as essential as courage. He observed how patrols and bounty hunters used fear as a tool. Public captures were intended to discourage escape and reinforce obedience. Punishments were displayed as examples demonstrating that flight was futile. Elijah internalized these lessons not as submission but as insight. He understood the psychological component of enforcement and used that understanding to plan around it. Fear could be anticipated, misdirected, or minimized through preparation and timing. Weather and terrain were additional factors in evading pursuing muddied tracks. Fog concealed movement and forest provided cover. Elijah learned to integrate environmental conditions into his calculations, turning natural features into allies. He studied how hunters adapted to these variables, anticipating their responses, and adjusting his strategy accordingly. Knowledge of both people and land became inseparable in his planning. Communication was critical under the threat of capture. Elijah relied on coded messages, signals, and songs to coordinate movement without revealing intent to outsiders. This system allowed him to warn others of patrols, redirect groups away from danger, and maintain cohesion even when physical separation occurred. The network of communication became a defensive infrastructure, reducing the likelihood of surprise and increasing the ability to respond effectively. Escape routes were never static. Patrols and hunters adapted to patterns, requiring constant adjustment. Elijah learned to rotate paths, create alternative plans,
and move unpredictably. Flexibility was not optional, it was essential. Each journey carried unique challenges, and failure to anticipate variability could result in capture. Elijah's understanding of pursuit became as complex as his knowledge of geography, intertwining human behavior, timing and environmental conditions. The presence of bounty hunters also shaped how Elijah thought about trust and alliance. Not all helpers could be relied upon equally. Some were more vulnerable to coercion, others more capable of concealment. Elijah learned to evaluate allies, communicate risks, and delegate responsibility without exposing critical information. Leadership was not only about movement, it was about protecting the integrity of the network against both external and internal threats. Capture by bounty hunters had consequences far beyond immediate imprisonment. Individuals could be sold further south, separated from family and community, and subjected to brutal punishment. Elijah understood that failure was not merely personal, it could destabilize entire networks and endanger others. This awareness added weight to every decision and fostered a deep sense of responsibility toward those he guided. Elijah also studied the methods used to recapture fugitives. He observed how hunters tracked scent, read tracks, questioned neighbors and used incentives to elicit information. By internalizing these tactics, he could anticipate movements, avoid detection, and exploit predictable patterns. Awareness of enemy methodology became a defensive tool, allowing him to act preemptively rather than reactive. The threat of patrols and bounty hunters instilled a dual sense of caution and resilience. Elijah could not ignore danger, but he also could not allow fear to paralyze him. He learned to operate under pressure, maintaining composure, clarity and focus, even when the odds were overwhelming. Discipline became a survival mechanism, reinforcing both practical decision-making and psychological endurance. Preparation extended beyond physical movement. Elijah trained others in how to behave under pursuit, teaching silence, patience and observation. He emphasized adaptability, ensuring that each individual could respond to threats independently, while remaining aligned with group objectives. Knowledge became empowerment, reducing the likelihood of panic-induced mistakes that could attract attention. Through repeated encounters with danger, Elijah developed a nuanced understanding of risk management. He learned to weigh the urgency of escape against the likelihood of interception, to balance the need for speed with the necessity of stealth, and to make choices that optimized survival for the group as a whole. This calculus required constant vigilance, critical thinking and the ability to anticipate variables beyond immediate control. The presence of bounty hunters and patrols shaped every aspect of Elijah's life, from daily routines to long-term strategy. They influenced when he moved, where he traveled, whom he trusted, and how he communicated. The constant pressure of surveillance forced adaptability, heightened awareness and refined judgment. Elijah understood that freedom was never guaranteed, and that survival depended on a combination of preparation, observation and resilience that could outmatch even the most persistent pursuers. Elijah Anderson's growing reputation among the enslaved as the Moses of Kentucky was not a title he sought, but one that emerged naturally from his actions in the lives he touched. In a world where hope was fragile and betrayal common, his ability to navigate escape, coordinate networks and protect others made him a figure of quiet reverence. The name reflected more than his leadership. It symbolized the possibility of liberation, the tangible sense that someone was working tirelessly to transform fear into freedom. Whispers of his deeds spread slowly at first, carried by those who had survived guided journeys, then amplified as his reputation grew beyond immediate circles. The title itself carried layered meaning. Moses, the biblical figure, led people out of bondage with wisdom, patience and courage. To call Elijah by this name was to recognize his role not merely as a facilitator of escape, but as a guide who understood the moral and strategic dimensions of liberation. He did not command armies or wield authority over willing subjects. Instead, he orchestrated delicate operations where lives hung in the balance and every decision had consequences far beyond the immediate moment. His leadership was subtle yet profound, emerging from knowledge, courage, and steadfast commitment. Elijah's renown was built through consistent action. It was not enough to plan escapes. Success depended on execution, on maintaining secrecy, and on protecting the network that enabled movement. Each successful journey reinforced trust, and word of those successes traveled discreetly, carried by individuals who understood the stakes. His reliability made him a central figure in the informal system of communication and coordination among enslaved people seeking freedom. He became a linchpin, someone whose presence could stabilize a group and whose absence was deeply felt. The growth of his reputation also had psychological effects on those around him. For many enslaved individuals, fear and despair were constant companions, and the idea of escape could seem impossible. Elijah's presence provided proof that action was possible, that routes could be navigated safely, and that networks existed to support them. His reputation inspired courage, not through boasting or overt displays of power, but through visible competence, careful planning and the ability to move undetected where others could not. Hope became more tangible because he embodied it in practice, yet with recognition came risk. The more people knew of Elijah, the greater the likelihood of discovery by authorities, bounty hunters or even informants within the enslaved community. He understood that fame in this context was dangerous. It could draw attention that endangered not only himself but those he guided. Reputation required careful management, balancing the need to inspire and lead with the imperative to remain hidden. Elijah's skill was in being known enough to instill confidence but not so widely that it compromised safety. Stories of his deeds traveled in coded language. Songs, phrases and gestures carried accounts of his guidance, allowing people to share information about him without exposing specifics to potential enemies. Even when names were mentioned, they were accompanied by caution, reinforcing the culture of secrecy that preserved life. Elijah's legend grew in whispers, a narrative built through survival and discreet acknowledgement, rather than public acknowledgement or written record. The title Moses also carried expectations. Elijah felt the weight of responsibility acutely. Those who sought his help trusted him with their lives and the lives of their families. Failure was not theoretical. It could mean recapture, punishment or death. The reverence he inspired was paired with accountability. Every decision, routes chosen, timing, coordination had to consider the consequences not only for immediate survival but for the long-term integrity of escape networks. Leadership demanded constant vigilance and ethical consideration. Elijah's growing reputation reinforced the networks of communication and cooperation that underpinned escapes. His reliability made him a central node within these informal systems, connecting people who might otherwise have been isolated. He served as a repository of knowledge, passing critical information about routes, patrols, and safe houses. The trust others placed in him allowed operations to expand as individuals who might have hesitated alone felt safer moving under his guidance. This collective effect amplified his influence without requiring overt authority. The legend of the Moses of Kentucky also served as a form of psychological resistance against the enslaver's narrative of power and inevitability. Slavery depended on the belief that escape was futile and that submission was the only viable strategy. Elijah's actions contradicted that narrative, demonstrating that defiance was possible and that freedom, while perilous, could be pursued. His reputation provided a counter-narrative, reminding people that the system's control was not absolute. Elijah's influence extended beyond physical guidance. His careful teaching of coded language, signals and risk assessment enabled others to operate independently when necessary. He cultivated skill and resilience in those around him, ensuring that knowledge was distributed rather than centralized entirely in his person. This not only increased operational security but also ensured that his legacy could continue through action, not only through the empowerment of others was a key dimension of why he was revered. Stories of his successes also carried symbolic power. Escapes that reached Ohio or Indiana became tales of survival, courage, and cunning. Even those who did not participate directly heard of these journeys and internalized the possibility they represented. The symbolic resonance of Elijah's work reinforced practical strategy with morale, creating a culture in which hope and action were intertwined. Each whisper of his deeds inspired others to believe that escape and freedom were attainable. His reputation also encouraged collaboration among different nodes of resistance. Free Black communities, abolitionists, and those still enslaved could align more effectively because a trusted guide existed to coordinate information and movement. Elijah became a bridge between disparate groups, his credibility ensuring that cooperation was feasible. Networks that might otherwise have been isolated or ineffective were strengthened by his central role. Yet Elijah maintained humility and discretion. He avoided ostentation and did not claim titles for himself. Recognition came from the community, not from his own declaration. He understood that survival depended on remaining vigilant and unseen, and that the legend he inspired needed to be sustainable rather than performative. His leadership was earned through action, reliability, and the protection of others rather than through assertion of authority. The name Moses also implied vision. Elijah understood that his role was not merely to guide individuals through immediate danger but to conceive of larger strategies, to see patterns of movement, timing, and risk in ways others could not. He balanced immediate tactical concerns with strategic foresight, ensuring that escapes could succeed not just in isolated cases but as part of a broader system of resistance. This vision reinforced both his reputation and the practical effectiveness of his work. Ultimately being called the Moses of Kentucky captured the intersection of action, ethics, and hope in Elijah Anderson's life. He did not seek the title, but it reflected the ways in which he transformed fear into possibility, invisibility into coordination, and individual courage into collective survival. His growing renown was inseparable from his skill, judgment, and dedication, making him
Elijah Anderson's legacy was forged not only in the success of escapes but in the ways he preserved knowledge, taught others, and inspired resilience across generations. Long after individual journeys ended, the strategies, practices, and ethos he instilled continued to influence those who sought freedom or supported escape networks. Elijah understood that survival required more than physical movement. It required education, preparation, and the careful cultivation of wisdom. Every lesson passed on, every observation remembered, became part of a cumulative body of knowledge that strengthened future resistance. Central to his impact was the mentoring of others. Elijah recognized that true liberation required collective capacity, not dependence on a single person, no matter how capable. He worked to teach individuals how to navigate terrain, read patrol patterns, interpret coded messages, and use signals effectively. His mentorship was subtle and adaptive, tailored to each person's experience, strengths, and weaknesses. He understood that people learn differently under pressure, and his guidance was calibrated to build confidence while maintaining safety. Elijah also emphasized critical thinking. He did not merely provide instructions, he encouraged those he guided to observe, question, and anticipate. By fostering independent judgment, he reduced reliance on his presence alone, increasing the likelihood of success for future operations. Individuals trained under his direction could adapt to unexpected obstacles, make decisions when separated from the main group, and understand the broader context of their movement. This cultivation of independent agency was as valuable as any map or route he could provide. Record-keeping existed in memory and oral tradition. Elijah was meticulous about remembering details, the location of safe houses, the timing of patrols, the nuances of terrain, and the behavioral patterns of those who might interfere. He understood that written records were dangerous, as they could be discovered and destroy networks. Memory became both archive and map, carrying lessons across journeys and time. He also instilled in others the discipline of observation and recall, ensuring that knowledge would be preserved even in his absence. The ethical dimension of his legacy was equally significant. Elijah guided individuals not simply to escape, but to navigate the moral complexities of survival. He taught discretion, respect for those who offered aid, and responsibility toward fellow travelers. He emphasized that freedom was not only a personal goal but a collective endeavor, one that required trust, sacrifice, and accountability. By modeling these principles, he created a culture of conscientious action, where practical strategies were inseparable from moral consideration. Elijah's influence extended beyond immediate escape networks. His work intersected with free Black communities, abolitionist supporters, and sympathetic allies, creating connections that amplified his impact. Knowledge flowed through multiple channels, reinforcing the resilience of the system as a whole. Each successful operation strengthened relationships and demonstrated the practical value of coordination, encouraging participation and support. Elijah became a hub, linking isolated efforts into a coherent network of resistance. Stories of his guidance carried symbolic power, reinforcing cultural and psychological resilience. Narratives of successful escapes, of careful planning, and of courage in the face of danger circulated in whispers, songs, and coded messages. These stories inspired hope and provided mental templates for action. Elijah's methods were thus preserved, not only through direct instruction but through example, creating a shared sense of possibility that transcended individual experience. He also emphasized adaptability. Every escape carried unique challenges, and Elijah taught the importance of adjusting strategies to changing circumstances. Patrols moved unpredictably, weather shifted, and alliances could falter. Elijah's approach emphasized observation, critical evaluation, and flexible response. This adaptability became a key principle transmitted to those who followed, ensuring that rigid adherence to a plan never jeopardized safety. Survival required both preparation and improvisation. Elijah's work nurtured courage, but not recklessness. He understood that fear could be harnessed, transformed into focus, and used to sustain careful action. His mentoring emphasized composure, teaching individuals how to act decisively under pressure while minimizing risk. The cultivation of courage was thus inseparable from discipline, observation, and adherence to strategy. Emotional control became as essential as physical skill. The dissemination of his methods reinforced the continuity of knowledge. Individuals who experienced escape under his guidance became educators themselves, passing on lessons to others. In this way, Elijah's impact multiplied, creating a ripple effect that extended well beyond his immediate action. Knowledge was the medium through which survival persisted, and he was both teacher and catalyst in that process. Elijah's legacy also challenged the assumptions of the enslaving system. Slavery depended on ignorance, isolation, and submission. By preserving knowledge, fostering networks, and empowering others, he undermined these foundations. His methods demonstrated that freedom could be pursued strategically, collectively, and sustained. Each successful escape and each transmission of knowledge proved that resistance was possible, creating a counter-narrative to the totalizing control claimed by the system. He emphasized observation as a tool of both survival and strategy. Attention to detail, how patrols moved, how local residents behaved, how terrain shifted with seasons was critical. Elijah taught that understanding context reduced risk and increased efficacy. Observation became a discipline, enabling individuals to anticipate danger, exploit opportunity, and make informed decisions. This principle became central to the culture of resistance he fostered. Elijah also modeled patience. He understood that haste could be fatal and that careful planning and timing were essential. He demonstrated that freedom required endurance, the ability to sustain effort over time while minimizing exposure. Teaching patience was not merely tactical, it cultivated psychological resilience, preparing those he guided to withstand fear, fatigue, and uncertainty without succumbing to panic or despair. Finally, Elijah's legacy lay in the integration of knowledge, courage, discipline, and morality into a coherent practice of resistance. He did not rely on force alone, nor on luck, nor on isolation. His approach combined careful planning, observation, mentorship, and ethical responsibility, creating a sustainable framework for action. The structures he helped establish, oral instruction, coded communication, coordinated escape routes, and communal networks, ensured that resistance could endure beyond individual acts. In this way, Elijah Anderson's influence persisted as both practical guidance and symbolic inspiration, shaping the lives of countless people who sought freedom, and reinforcing the principle that liberation was both possible and necessary. Elijah Anderson's story is more than a tale of escape. It is a testament to courage, ingenuity, and the unbreakable human spirit. He transformed fear into strategy, secrecy into connection, and oppression into opportunity, leaving a legacy that cannot be measured merely in miles traveled or people freed. He became a symbol of hope, a living proof that even in the darkest circumstances, agency and resilience can prevail. His life reminds us that freedom is not given, it is claimed, nurtured, and defended with intelligence, patience, and unwavering moral courage. The true power of Elijah's legacy lies in its enduring lessons, that leadership is service, that knowledge is liberation, and that one individual's determination can ignite collective change. He teaches that courage is not the absence of fear, but the deliberate choice to act despite it, and that resistance, however quiet or invisible, reshapes the world for those who follow. Elijah Anderson was in every sense a Moses, not only guiding people across physical borders, but leading generations toward the vision of dignity, autonomy, and hope that slavery sought to extinguish. His life challenges us to remember that history is not only written in grand battles or political decrees, but in the quiet, relentless acts of those who refuse to accept oppression as destiny. Elijah's courage whispers across time, urging us to recognize the power of resilience, the value of knowledge, and the unyielding human drive for freedom. His story is a beacon, illuminating